The black waiter was mocked until he said, "I fed you when you were hungry, so you don't remember me, do you?" The waiter's voice was calm. Too calm for a man holding back years of pain. The restaurant fell silent for a moment, only the jazz music whispering in the background. The man in the gray suit looked up, confused, a smirk already forming on his lips. "What, should I?" He laughed, his friends chuckling beside him. Daniel stood there, tray trembling slightly in his hands. The smell of steak and red wine filled the air, but all he could taste was bitterness. He had served men like this for years, men who spoke loud, tipped little, and never looked him in the eye. But tonight felt different. Something inside him was breaking, or maybe awakening. Just 5 minutes earlier, they had mocked him, called him boy, snapped fingers at him like he was some kind of servant from another century. One even tossed a napkin at his feet, laughing when Daniel bent to pick it up. The laughter still echoed in his head. But now, standing before them, his eyes held something new. Not anger, not fear. Truth. He took a slow breath, forcing the words out. "You used to come to St. Mary's Shelter 12 years ago. You were hungry, sir. I was the one who gave you food that night." The smirk on the man's face faded. His friends went quiet. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of a glass setting down on the table was the only thing that broke the silence. Daniel's chest tightened. He hadn't planned to speak, but the words came like a storm that had waited too long to rain. Behind his calm tone was a story of hunger, loss, and survival, things these men couldn't begin to understand. Maria, the waitress beside him, froze in shock. She'd never seen Daniel look so alive, so human. There was something in his voice, something that made even the proudest heart tremble. And that's when it began. The night that changed everything. For a few seconds, no one said a word. The restaurant, once full of laughter and noise, went quiet, like time itself had stopped to listen. The man in the gray suit stared at Daniel, his mouth slightly open. His friends exchanged awkward looks, pretending to check their phones, but their eyes couldn't hide the shock. Daniel stood tall now, tray steady in his hand. The confidence in his eyes wasn't pride, it was dignity. He wasn't just a waiter anymore. He was a man reminding another of a forgotten truth. I don't know what you're talking about," the man muttered, but his voice cracked. He looked down, then up again, searching Daniel's face for something familiar. "You came to St. Mary's Shelter in 2013, Daniel said quietly. "It was winter. You had no coat, no shoes. I was working in the kitchen back then, helping serve the homeless. You were shivering. You cried when I handed you soup. You said you hadn't eaten in 3 days. A flicker of memory crossed the man's face. His friends froze. The one sitting next to him whispered, "Wait, John, is that true?" John, the man in the gray suit, swallowed hard. I don't remember," he said weakly, though everyone knew he did. His hand trembled as he reached for his glass. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't want revenge. He wanted understanding. "You told me that night you'd never forget the people who helped you," Daniel continued softly. "You said one day, when life got better, you'd be kind too." John looked away, shame coloring his face. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier. His laughter from earlier felt like poison lingering in the air. Maria whispered to Daniel, "You okay?" He nodded slightly, but inside, his heart hurt. He didn't want to humiliate anyone. He just wanted to remind them that kindness costs nothing, and that the people we look down on might be the ones who once helped us stand. Daniel picked up the empty plates from their table and walked away quietly. But everyone in the restaurant watched him. Every single person. No one laughed anymore. When Daniel stepped into the back kitchen, the noise of sizzling pans and clattering dishes filled the silence that had followed him. Maria caught his arm. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "They're just drunk men. They'll forget by tomorrow." Daniel looked at her with tired eyes. "That's the problem, Maria," he said softly. "They always forget. People like them always do." He set down the tray, his hands still trembling slightly. For years he had learned to stay quiet, to swallow words that burned inside him. But tonight something inside him had broken free, not out of anger, but out of truth. As he washed the dishes, memories flooded back. He was 20 then, sleeping on park benches, searching for jobs that never called back. His mother had passed away. His father had disappeared long ago. He remembered standing in line outside St. Mary's shelter, cold and hungry, when Sister Elaine handed him a bowl of soup and told him, "Help others when you stand again, son." That moment had changed him. It gave him purpose. He worked at the shelter for 2 years, cleaning floors, cooking meals, feeding people who were lost like he once was. That's where he had met John, the man from the restaurant. Back then, John was nothing but a broken soul, whispering thanks between tears as he ate the food Daniel had served him. Daniel never forgot his face, not because of pity, but because he saw himself in him, lost, hungry, desperate, and tonight, when that same man mocked him, it cut deeper than any insult ever could. He dried his hands, staring at the mirror above the sink. His reflection looked tired but steady. "I didn't do it to shame him," he whispered to himself. "I just wanted him to remember." Outside, through the kitchen door, Daniel could still feel the weight of everyone's eyes. Something told him this night wasn't over yet. John sat frozen at his table long after Daniel walked away. His hands rested on the white tablecloth, but he couldn't stop them from shaking. The laughter that had filled the room earlier now felt like a memory from another life. He could still hear Daniel's calm voice echoing in his head. "You were hungry, and I fed you." For the first time in years, John felt small. His friends tried to lighten the mood, throwing awkward jokes, but none landed. "Come on, man," one said softly. "He's just some waiter. Forget it." But John couldn't, because deep inside, he remembered. That winter night had never truly left him. He had been jobless, homeless, and hopeless. He'd lost his company after a bad investment and spent months living out of his car. The night he stumbled into St. Mary's shelter, he had been ready to give up. He remembered the young man who had handed him soup and a sandwich, with a smile so kind it broke his heart. That man had been Daniel. Now the same man stood before him, serving his table, and John had mocked him. He pressed his hands against his face, feeling the weight of shame. "How did I become this person?" he thought. The money, the business suits, the fancy restaurants, they had made him forget the hunger, the fear, the people who helped him rise again. John stood up quietly, ignoring the confused looks from his friends. "I'll be right back," he said. His voice trembled as he walked toward the kitchen doors. He pushed them open and saw Daniel cleaning a counter, shoulders slightly hunched. "Daniel," John said, his voice low. Daniel turned, surprised. "I remember now," John whispered. "It was me. You saved me that night. I was lost. And you fed me." Daniel looked at him, silent, his eyes soft but guarded. "I didn't save you, sir," he said quietly. "You just needed someone to remind you that you were still human." John nodded slowly, eyes wet. For the first time in years, he felt human again. John stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the sounds of sizzling pans and clattering dishes surrounding him like background noise to his guilt. Daniel turned away, focusing on the sink again, pretending to scrub a plate that was already spotless. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want pity. He just wanted peace. But John wasn't ready to walk away. He took a hesitant step forward. "Daniel," he began softly, "I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight, but for forgetting who I used to be." Daniel didn't look up. "It's fine, sir. You don't owe me anything. People forget. That's how life is." His tone was calm, but his heart was heavy. He had heard empty apologies before, words that vanished as quickly as they came. But John didn't leave. He stood there, his voice breaking. "No, it's not fine. You gave me food when I had nothing. You looked at me like I was still worth something. And tonight, I treated you like you were nothing." His eyes filled with tears. "That's not who I want to be." Daniel finally looked at him. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two men from different worlds connected by one forgotten night of kindness. "You know," Daniel said softly, "when I worked at that shelter, I used to think feeding people was just about food. But it wasn't. It was about dignity. Everyone deserves to feel seen. John nodded slowly, swallowing hard. You're right. I lost that somewhere along the way. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the counter. I own a company now, real estate. If you ever want something better, call me. Not as charity, as a man giving another man an opportunity. Daniel looked at the card, then back at John. Thank you, he said quietly. But I'm okay where I am. I'm not waiting for a better life, sir. I'm building one. John's eyes glistened with respect. For the first time that night he smiled. Not out of pride, but humility. Then maybe I should learn from you. And with that, the man who once mocked walked away, changed. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall restaurant windows, painting golden lines across the floor. Daniel came in early as always, tying his apron with quiet focus. He didn't expect anything to change. People forget fast in this world. But something about last night still lingered in his chest, like the echo of a storm that finally passed. Maria walked in behind him, grinning softly. You made the whole restaurant go silent yesterday, she said. I've never seen that before. Daniel chuckled lightly. Yeah, well, silence can teach more than shouting ever could. Meanwhile, across the city, John sat in his office staring at the window. He had been awake most of the night replaying Daniel's words. You just needed someone to remind you that you were still human. Those words hit deeper than any business loss or success. He realized how far he had drifted from the man he once was, the man who knew pain, hunger, and humility. Without telling anyone, John called St. Mary's Shelter that afternoon, the same shelter where he once found hope and where Daniel had once worked. Do you still take volunteers? He asked quietly. Always, the voice on the other end said. That weekend, John showed up with his sleeves rolled up and hands ready to serve. He spent hours washing dishes, handing out food, and listening to stories of people struggling. Stories that reminded him of himself. Every face he saw carried a piece of his past, and when one of the men asked, "Why's a guy like you doing this?" John smiled gently. Because someone once fed me when I was hungry. Back at the restaurant, Daniel didn't know about John's visit. He only knew that something inside him felt lighter. He had faced humiliation with grace and walked away with his dignity untouched. Sometimes, Daniel thought, you don't need to fight to change people. You just have to remind them what kindness looks like. 2 weeks passed quietly. Life at the Blue Harbor restaurant went back to its rhythm. Clinking glasses, soft jazz, and the steady footsteps of waiters moving like shadows between tables. Daniel worked the evening shift again, calm as ever, though his coworkers still whispered about that unforgettable night. Do you think he'll ever come back? Maria asked one afternoon while polishing silverware. Daniel smiled faintly. People come and go, Maria, but lessons, they stay. That evening, the dinner rush began as usual. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and perfume and the soft hum of money in the air. Daniel was serving table 12 when the host approached. Daniel, someone asked for you, she said. They said it's important. He turned, wiping his hands on his apron. Standing near the entrance was John, not in his usual expensive suit, but in a simple shirt and worn jacket. He looked different, softer, lighter, like a man who'd finally put down a heavy burden. Daniel hesitated, then walked over. Good evening, sir, he said politely. John smiled. No sir today, please. Just John, Daniel nodded slowly. All right, John, what brings you back? John took a deep breath, glancing around the restaurant. I wanted to thank you. Properly this time. You reminded me of something I forgot long ago. He reached into his jacket and handed Daniel a small brown envelope. This isn't charity, he said. It's a donation, in your name, to St. Mary's Shelter. They said you used to work there. I thought maybe we could help them feed a few more hungry souls. Daniel opened the envelope slightly and saw a check inside. More than he'd make in a year. His throat tightened. You didn't have to. I did, John interrupted gently. You gave me back my humanity. I just want to pass it forward. For a moment, the two men stood in silence. No suits, no uniforms, just two people who had met once in pain and again in grace. Daniel smiled softly. "Then I guess we're both feeding people again." John laughed quietly, eyes shining. "Yeah," he said, "only this time it's not just food." And in that moment, forgiveness wasn't spoken. It was felt. A month later, the wind in Chicago carried the first hint of winter again. Cold enough to sting. Soft enough to remind Daniel of the night that changed everything. He stood outside St. Mary's shelter, holding a box of canned food. The evening sky glowed orange, fading into the blue of another long night. Inside, the shelter buzzed with life. Laughter, clinking bowls, people talking about nothing and everything. It smelled of soup, hope, and second chances. Daniel set the box down on the counter when a familiar voice called from behind. "You still work too hard, don't you?" He turned, and there was John. No longer the man in the gray suit, no longer carrying the weight of arrogance. He wore a volunteer apron, sleeves rolled up, handing out bread to a man in line. Daniel smiled. "Didn't think you'd actually stick around," he teased. John laughed softly. "I told you I was learning from you." They worked side by side for hours. Daniel serving soup, John handing out bread, both silent but connected by something deeper than words. Around them, faces of gratitude filled the room. People who had been invisible to the world but not to them. Later that night, as the crowd thinned, John looked at Daniel and said quietly, "You know, that night in the restaurant. I thought you ruined my pride, but now I see. You saved it." Daniel smiled, looking around at the people eating, some smiling, some praying. "We all fall, John. The only difference is what we do when someone helps us stand again." Outside, the city lights shimmered across the wet streets. A homeless man walked up to the shelter door, shivering. Daniel stepped forward and handed him a bowl of soup with a warm smile. The man's eyes filled with tears. And just like that, the circle of kindness began again. As they watched the man eat, John whispered, "You fed me when I was hungry. Now you've fed my soul." Daniel looked at him, his voice gentle. "That's all any of us can do, John. Feed each other when the world forgets." The night was quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was wholly the end.